With television having existed for several years, it is undeniable that several disturbing incidents have occurred on it, catching viewers off guard. In this video, I'll be covering an iceberg that I made about disturbing TV moments. As obvious, viewer discretion is advised, but I'll warn you again later in the video. As in the previous iceberg, this one will start right on tier 2 because the first tier is boring. I'm Sir Chris, I explore the internet and I make videos about it. Let's go.
Tier 2.
Accidents. Live shows with dangerous stunts are certainly nothing new. Even though most of them are planned off stage, the chance of them going wrong is never zero. On March 27th of 1985, during an episode of the talk show Hot Properties, Richard Belzer, the host, ends up having two special guests on the show, Hulk Hogan and Mr. T, with the intention of promoting their first upcoming tag team match and the first ever match of WrestleMania 1. In this episode, Richard asks Hogan to show a wrestling trick. As requested, Hulk ends up putting Richard in a groove-it, or better known as a guillotine choke. A dangerous move that at worst can break someone's neck if not done carefully. At the time of the trick, Hulk does this for a few seconds, during which, without knowing, Richard becomes unconscious. In which Hulk, when letting go of him, falls, hits his head on the floor, and starts to bleed, leaving the audience confused and shocked. Even with this incident, both sides act professionally. Richard, while still bleeding, regained his consciousness, got up, and went on a commercial break as if nothing had happened. And Richard on the break goes to the hospital. After the commercial break, Hulk, remorseful and now in low energy, starts apologizing, saying that he never meant to hurt Richard. And this incident caused Richard to sue Hulk for the damages caused. While Richard was able to heal after this accident, this wrestler wasn't that fortunate. Darren Drozdov, or better known as Droz, was a previous professional football player who later transitioned to wrestling, fighting for several years until October 5th of 1999, where a tragic injury would change his life forever. On that night, Droz wore a loose shirt to fight against his opponent, D'Lo Brown. In the middle of the fight, D'Lo ends up doing a powerbomb, but because of Droz's shirt, D'Lo ends up not being able to get a good grip, and Droz ends up not being able to get into position for the powerbomb, which ends with Droz falling on his head and not on his back. After that move, D'Lo would ask Droz if he was okay, but sadly it was not. That tragic accident ended his wrestling career due to a fracture of two vertebrae in his neck, and thus leaving him quadriplegic. That incident also left his opponent with an everlasting mental scar, since D'Lo never forgave himself for what happened that night, with Droz stating even on that day, while he remained motionless, that it wasn't D'Lo's fault. With the accident in the ring, the WWF, out of respect, ended up not broadcasting the tip of the fight. White Ford Bronco. One of the most watched police chases in American history. Before the incident on June 17th of 1994, O.J. Simpson was a well-known celebrity in the United States, appearing in American football games, films, and commercials. On June 12th of that year, his ex-wife, Nicole Simpson, and a friend of hers, Ronald Goldman, were murdered outside Nicole's apartment at 10 p.m., in which evidence and the past behavior of her ex made him the prime suspect. The police and the actor's lawyers made an agreement where OG would turn himself in at the police station at 11 a.m. on June 17th. But on that day, OG had a different plan. When the time passes and OG doesn't show up at the station, the police goes looking for him, leading to a huge manhunt both for the police and for the media. Just for you to know how popular this was, later in the chase, various mobs of people would gather in different areas of the highways just to cheer him up. At around 6 p.m., Alan, the driver, would make a call to 911 stating that they were okay, but OG was armed and intended on using the gun on himself. The chase would reach its climax when they both arrived at the OG's house, where they eventually end up being surrounded and negotiations begun until they reach an agreement and OG gets arrested. Although he got arrested, the question if he was the perpetrator or not is still being debated to this day. The tank incident. What if you were on your normal day? You just left your job and you're driving home, but suddenly you see a tank. What would you do? Although this is an insane or even scary entry, it's somewhat comical. On May 17th of 1995, Sean Nelson, a former Army veteran, went to the California Army National Guard Armory, stole an AIM-60A3 tank, and drove it in the streets of San Diego, bringing havoc and chaos. But why? For that, I have to give you his background. Sean Nelson was born on August 21st of 1959. In 1978, he enlists himself in the army and is stationed as a tank commander. He ends up being honorably discharged, although for questionable reasons. Sean eventually ends up marrying his wife Susie Hellman in 1984 and had a successful career in plumbing to the point of leaving his job to start his own business in 1991. Although things seemed to be going well for him, behind the scenes, it was fighting against a drug and alcohol addiction, even stated by his own brother. The man who died was only a shell of a person we loved. The real Sean died 2 years ago at the hands of drugs and alcohol. That eventually makes his wife leave him. In 1992, Nelson ended up suing the same hospital he had already sued in 1990, this time for medical negligence that allegedly led to his mother passing away with cancer. But those lawsuits would be dismissed in 1993, where now Sean had to pay $6,000, which at the time was a huge chunk of money. He broke his neck in a bike accident, was about to get evicted, and his van and plumbing tools ended up getting stolen, which meant that he couldn't work or couldn't get a job quickly that would allow him to pay his rent. I kinda felt bad for the dude. All of that came boiling down until the date that I've previously talked about, where he ended up doing almost $150,000 in damages in just 23 minutes. This chaos would eventually end when he crashed against a 3-foot traffic barrier, got stuck, and he was shot in the shoulder and lost his life. Xuxa Park. Xuxa Park was a children's program that premiered on Brazilian television from 1997 to 2001. The program was made in front of a live audience, and it became very popular due to its incredible effort, especially for the time, which even broke viewing records. But what survives to this day from the program, apart from a few episodes, was the reason for its closure. On January 11th of 2001, the crew and the audience were in the studio making a special episode that would be aired at the carnival. In the recording, we can see the team dancing while smoke gradually appears. One of the security guards quickly appeared with a fire extinguisher to put out the small fire that started due to a short circuit. But in just seconds, the fire grows so large due to the highly flammable material that quickly swallows the ship and eventually the studio. All of this happened 5 minutes before they finished. In the same recording, we can see all the people running away and even the small group of people that bolted back into danger to save one kid that got stuck near the fire, thankfully saving her life. In this incident, 26 people were injured, with the previous kid being the one with the most severe injuries, but thankfully all the victims recovered. Out of respect, the show ended, thus having its final 8 episodes removed from television, turning them into a lost media.
Tier 3.
Hostage. In the 80s, it wasn't uncommon for family members of the presenters to watch the broadcast live right in the studio. On August 19th of 1987, Gary Stallman, son of Max Stallman, a pharmacist who worked at the station KNBC News, calls one of the anchors, Kirsty Wilde, to ask if he could watch the news live, since he never had the opportunity to see his father when he worked there, to which Kirsty said yes. At around 4:40 p.m. on August 19th, while they were live, David Horowitz, another anchorer, while presenting his section of the news, is interrupted by Gary, who appears behind him, pointing a gun and forces him to read a manifesto. The full manifesto does not exist on the internet, and the hunt for the whole manifesto is still at bay. But what exists for us to see is strange. It talks about aliens, conspiracies involving the CIA, teletransportation, and even that his father had been replaced by a clone. But 20 seconds later, the transmission cuts to a slide without Gary noticing, but the camera continues to record. The manifesto ended up thanking David for reading it out loud, and the fact that the weapon was actually an empty BB gun. By the time that David ended reading, the police were already in position, but Gary puts the gun on the table, thus surrendering and getting arrested off camera. As scary as that was, the way David reacted was impressive. It was as if the gun didn't exist. Dale Earnhardt. NASCAR has the same feeling as Formula 1. Danger is always lurking around every corner, while thousands are watching. It's not the first time that I've covered a racing tragedy on this channel. Dale Earnhardt was the son of the former NASCAR driver, Ralph Earnhardt, who inherited his father's traits and grew up loving the same sport as his dad. So much so that in his childhood, Dale ended up borrowing his dad's car to go to a race in which he almost won against his father's closest competitor. And eventually, he joined NASCAR in 1975, 2 years after his father's passing. Dale ended up becoming such a legend that in the 676 races, he got top 10 428 times, got pole position 22 times, and won 76 races. His way of driving and his attitude gave him one of the coolest names I've heard, the Intimidator. Even though he faced some threatening crashes in his career, there was one that sadly marked NASCAR forever. In his last race, the Daytona 500, a 200-lap race, he was going against his friend Michael Waltrip and Dale's own son. Allegedly, at the time the three had an agreement. The first one to get first place among the three would be helped by the other two. Michael was in first, Dale's son in second, and Dale in third. The accident happened on the last lap when Dale's car collided with Shredder's car and both hit the wall. Shredder would get out of his car, but sadly, Dale remained motionless. Despite being rushed to the hospital, Dale would be declared dead when he arrived. There was a lot of controversy regarding the cause of his death, and with this tragedy, NASCAR improved their safety measures. Earthquake. We can all agree that earthquakes and tornadoes are two of the scariest experiences that can happen, and 1989 was the year that marked California. That year, from June to October, several earthquakes with magnitudes ranging from 4 to 5.4 occurred at Loma Prieta Peak, causing several damages to structures that extended to several cities. But those damages would only be the beginning of a bigger tragedy. Because on October 17th of 1989, at around 5 p.m., several routines and programs were interrupted by a 6.9 magnitude earthquake. Bridges collapsed, more than thousands of houses, businesses and schools were destroyed, 63 people lost their lives, and more than 3,000 were injured. The damage was enormous, to the point that the loss was $6 billion. What makes this more scary is that there's a lot of videos from security cameras, camcorders, and even one of the most well-known of them all, the baseball game that was interrupted, giving us a glimpse of the horror they had to face. The Dating Game. The Dating Game was an American program that appeared on December 20th of 1965. The program consisted of a game where one woman had to ask questions to 3 men, and at the end, with just 60 seconds, choose which one of them she wanted to go on a date with. The questions could vary between several topics, but the only type of questions that could not be asked were those that revealed the identity of the participants. The program had good faces, however, it would be later tainted by one episode that had a serial killer, Rodney Alcala, also known as the Dating Game Killer. Rodney Alcala was a serial killer and a sex offender responsible for 8 murders, although police believe that the number of victims is way higher. He will target young women by using his looks, charisma, and supposed job to gain their trust with the sole intention of doing horrible things to them. On September 13th of 1978, in the midst of his killing spree, Rodney Alcala would participate in an episode of the Dating Game, bringing a strange and ominous feeling to the stage with his answers, especially after knowing who he was.
A bachelor number 1, I am serving you for dinner. What are you called and what do you look like?
I'm called the Banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
If things could not get any worse, he would eventually be chosen by the woman, but she in the end would eventually refuse to go out with him because he was creepy, with that answer most likely saving her life that day. And despite being sentenced to death 3 times, it would die in prison in 2021 by natural causes. Wetten Dass. Wetten Dass, or in English Wanna Bet That, was a German television program which started on February 14th of 1981. The program only aired 6 to 8 times a year, and when it did, millions would tune in to watch. Wetten Dass consisted of people doing bizarre or difficult challenges to try to win the prize. On December 4th of 2010, Wetten Dass went live again, and began with a challenge that was being done by Samuel Koch, a stuntman with experience. At the time, the stunt he was going to perform consisted on using spring-loaded boots to jump over cars that were moving and were driven by friends and family. But as he passed the level, the car became longer. Samuel passes the first, gives up on the second, passes the third, but when he gets to the 4th car that was being driven by his dad, Samuel ends up not jumping high enough, hits his helmet on the windshield, and falls face down to the ground. I can't even imagine how his dad must have felt. After the fall, the camera quickly switches to the face of one of the judges, since that program didn't cut to commercial breaks. The packed room gets silent and shocked as the medical team treats Samuel, who was lying down, unconscious. Just a few minutes later, the team decided to end the program early as they didn't want to continue, but wanted to know if Samuel was going to be okay. Fortunately, Samuel survived, but he broke 2 cervical vertebrae, damaged his spinal cord, and was permanently paralyzed from the neck down. From this episode onwards, the show began to decline and was cancelled in 2014 despite several revival attempts. And Samuel eventually pursued an acting career in which he was successful.
Tier 4.
Ghostwatch. Ghostwatch, it's a film that needs no introduction, but for the sake of the video, I'll give a quick breakdown. Ghostwatch was a BBC special film for the Halloween. They showed a pre-recorded episode that intended to look and feel real. On the Halloween of 1992, Ghostwatch was aired and was only broadcasted once in the UK. The episode consisted of the Ghostwatch team trying to prove if ghosts really exist or not. With that, the team ends up going to a haunted house in London. That house belonged to the family of Pamela Early, who suffered from paranormal activity from an aggressive spirit called Pipes, who made noise in the pipes of the house. At first, both reporters think it's just a hoax, especially since they caught one of Pamela's daughters, Suzanne, making the same sound with a hammer. Minutes later, weird stuff started to happen. Out of nowhere, the team goes up to the room to discover that Suzanne is now covered in scratches. From here, things get more agitated. In addition to the wounds, Suzanne is now possessed, loud noises are happening throughout the house, and everything starts to go downhill quickly. The episode ends with the last anchor being possessed by having seen the footage, and the episode abruptly ends. Although the program gave a warning at the beginning saying that it was fiction, the spectators who tuned in later didn't have that luxury. But unfortunately, the unexpected happened. One of the spectators, Martin Denham, an 18-year-old boy with a learning disability, ends up being terrified and paranoid after watching the episode, a behavior that he had never shown. That night, when Martin goes to sleep, he ends up getting even more scared because of the noises in his house coming from the water pipes. This would take a huge mental toll on Marvin. He couldn't sleep without having the lights on, and surely that affected his sleep. 5 days passed, and Marvin couldn't take it anymore, and took his own life. All of this because, allegedly, the show didn't do much to tell the viewers that what they were seeing was fiction, and this tragedy caused the show to be banned from the UK. El Valor de la Verdad. This program is the real definition of the truth hurts. El Valor de la Verdad, or the value of truth, was the adaptation of the program Nothing But the Truth for the Latino television, first appearing in Peru on June 7th of 2012. The program was based on the participant answering questions while connected to a polygraph. As the participant answered and moved up the levels, the questions would become more difficult and embarrassing, but in return, he would earn more money. The hardest part of this program is that the participant had to bring his family, who would be sat close to the participant, and thus being exposed to the embarrassing answers. The rules were simple. You can leave whenever you want before you get the question, you can't lie, and the family could only skip one question. The first episode brought controversy right away, and I'll tell you why in a minute. The first episode of the program was with Ruth Dalia Sayas. At the beginning it starts easy, but later on gets difficult, to the point where you can see how affected her boyfriend and parents were, with some of the hard questions being: have you ever felt ashamed of your parents' manners? Are you with your boyfriend until someone better comes along? You work at a nightclub. Have you accepted money in exchange for sex? Allegedly, that one being the last question before she stopped and left the show with $4,000 in today's value. The show allegedly ended up with the following sentence: the truth is always illuminating. It will not do harm, even though it hurts. That, if true, it made it more haunting. The episode gave her a lot of attention for her honesty, but she also got a lot of harassment to the point of Ruth not wanting to leave the house. 2 months after appearing on the show, Ruth would be killed by her own boyfriend, Brian Romero. Brian did it because of the shame that those revelations made him go through, and also because he thought he deserved half of the money that Ruth had earned. He eventually confessed to the murder, and thankfully Brian was sentenced to life in prison. Just Like Mom. Just Like Mom was a game show like the others, even though it had a small twist. This Canadian show would have 3 children, one from each family, who participated in 2 different games: questions and cooking, where in the end, the mother would have to guess which food her child made or what answer her child gave, in which if right, they would win points. The winning team would win prizes, with the child winning one of the many rewards on the roulette wheel. As innocent as this program seemed, it actually contained a big problem. One of its controversies, which only arose when the program had a rerun in 2008, was the way one of the hosts acted around children. Alvar was one of the hosts of the game show, the other one being his wife at the time. During some episodes of this game show, Fergie would kiss some of the children in the mouth, he would compliment them, and even kiss them without their consent. This would happen a lot of times, to the point of existing compilations of him being inappropriate. Some might say it was a different era, but that doesn't eliminate the fact that kissing a stranger's child in the mouth is extremely creepy. Not a lot of information about Fergie exists on the internet, but he would continue his career and eventually retire in 1996. Bulldozer. This is one of the most unique and insane entries in the Iceberg. Marvin E. Meyer, a former USF veteran, wreaked havoc in the streets of Colorado in 2004 with a fortified bulldozer for more than 2 hours, with no sign of stopping soon. But before we get to that, years before the incident, Marvin was known for being a person who would help anyone. But like everyone else, he had his problems. In 1992, Marvin purchased the land and opened a muffler repair and welding shop in Gran. In the 2000s, a citizen of Gran wanted to buy Marvin's land to build a cement processing plant. After back and forth, the offer was denied, which made them buy the land on the opposite side of Marvin's store. With that purchase, the processing plant blocked the quickest entrance to Marvin's store, in which Marvin, to counter this, asks the Gran Town Council to build a street that leads to his store, which is also denied. This makes Marvin more angry because he had already bought a bulldozer to do it himself. That same council ends up fining him for various infractions, one of them being the fact that his business was not connected to the town's sewer system, and would eventually keep fining him, unless of course, if he fixed that. But even if he wanted to, he couldn't, due to allegedly his neighbor not giving consent for a sewage line to pass through his private property. The accumulation of all of that forced Marvin's business to close in October 2002, but he wouldn't let that slide. During 2003 and 2004, Marvin ends up turning his previous bulldozer into a monster. With several materials, he makes a makeshift armor that was placed around the cabin, motor, and vital parts of the bulldozer. For visibility, he had placed cameras who were also protected, that were connected to 3 monitors inside the cabin. It was also equipped with 3 firearms, 1 position on each side. Safe to say that he was pissed. And on June 4th of 2004, Marvin ends up using that bulldozer to destroy several specific buildings, which in total caused $7 million in damages. Just for you to know how effective the armor was, it resisted against 200 bullets, some of which were armor piercing, and a flashbang, causing literally no damage. But the terror finally ended when one of the radiators was damaged, and soon after, the bulldozer got stuck in the basement of one of the buildings, and Marvin took his own life. Despite the several damages, no one was injured. Monica Seles. How far can one's obsession and envy go? During 1990 to 1992, a new competitor in women's tennis emerged and dominated the competitions she participated in, to the point of winning 36 consecutive matches and 6 consecutive tournaments. Monica Seles, a 17-year-old teenager, quickly gained a reputation as one of the best players to ever represent Yugoslavia. As of February 1993, she had 159 wins and 12 losses. But something in that year happened that would change that course forever. On April 30th of 1993, during the quarterfinals, Monica was playing against Magdalena in the Citizen Cup tournament in Germany. At that time, Monica had already won the first game and was winning the second. But when she takes a break and sits down, the unexpected happens. Suddenly, a man gets up and runs behind Monica and stabs her in the shoulder, but is quickly detained by security guards and even by spectators. But it was sadly too late. The injury barely missed her spine, and it caused confusion among the spectators, who didn't exactly understand what happened due to how fast it was. And Monica was quickly transported to the hospital. The man who did this was Günther Parch, an obsessed fan of Steffi Graf, the former top 1 who came in second place due to Monica's performance. According to the authorities, Günther intended on injuring Monica so that Graf would become top 1 again, and the perpetrator was only sentenced to 2 years probation and psychological treatment. Tragically, this incident made Monica stay away from tennis for 2 years, during which time she suffered from depression. And when she came back, Monica was never the same.
Year 5.
1961 Italian Grand Prix. From this moment on, this will be your last warning. With Formula 1 in its early stages, there were many methods of protection. On September 10th of 1961, the Italian Grand Prix took place at Monza and was the 7th of the 8 tracks that season. 32 participated. Of those 32, 20 ended up being withdrawn from the race, 17 due to car problems, and 3 due to accidents, with one of them being fatal. On the second lap, one of the drivers, Wolfgang von Trips, who was driving for Ferrari, tries to overtake one of his opponents, Jim Clark. Eventually, both cars came into contact, in which Wolfgang loses control, with his car flipping towards the crowd, taking the lives of 15, one of them being the driver. One of the scariest things is that there are photos taken by one of the audience's cameras, which shows the driver's car flying towards the audience, milliseconds before hitting them. And tragically, that day will be remembered as one of the darkest days in Formula 1. Aqui Agora. Aqui Agora, or in English Here Now, was an old Brazilian news program that appeared in 1991. It focused mainly on covering heavy news, or as they themselves say in their slogan, a vibrant news, a weapon of the people, that shows on TV how life really is. Some of those heavy news were the recordings of the rebellion in Candeiro, the case of Manilla Crisis, etc. But the incident I'm going to cover in this entry was that of Danielle Alves. On June 5th of 1993, Danielle Alves, a 16-year-old teenager, went up to the commercial building where she worked at and sat on the edge. Upon seeing her, the doorman called the firefighters, who arrived at the same time as the reporters, who were already recording. But before the firefighters could execute the plan, Alves jumps. If this wasn't horrible enough, the same reporters, without knowing the real reason why it happened, started to invent a reason. First, it was because of a drug addiction, and then because she suffered physical abuse from her parents, being the real reason, a broken heart. The same team in a cruel act went to the parents' house and brought them to the police station to be the first ones to inform them. SPT was eventually sued by the family and had to pay 1 million reais in moral damages. C.O.P.S. C.O.P.S, again, needs no introduction. It's a program that documented real police operations. On August 26th of 2014, a police patrol accompanied by 2 crew members, Bryce Dion and Michael Lee, responded to a call for backup in an armed robbery at a Wendy's. When they get there, the police made a plan and executed it, with the crew members who had body armor accompanying them. When the police enter, they see that the suspect was armed, later being with an airsoft identical to a real firearm. The suspect aimed at the officers, which then a gunfight broke out. In the middle of this, the suspect will try to flee, passing through Bryce Dion, the audio technician, who accidentally gets hit by an officer round in an unprotected area, making him unconscious on the scene. He would later be transported to the hospital, but sadly, Bryce didn't make it. This accident caused a lot of controversy, varying from the procedures of the show to his death being possibly avoidable. As a way to honor his tragic passing, a dedicated tribute episode was aired, showing Bryce's best works in his 7-year career. Jenny Jones Show. This is one of the longest talk shows we have on the list. Jenny Jones Show was like any other talk show. It first started with innocent topics, until in the second season, the show did a 180, with now controversial topics about relationships, while doing everything they could to boost their ratings. Of several episodes, there was one that only lasted 3 days because of what happened. The revealing same-sex crush episode. The show was pretty simple. Several groups of 2 people participated, with one of them having a crush on the other. First, the admirer appeared on the stage, who was asked several questions both by the presenter and the audience, while the crush was in a separate room. Eventually, the supposed crush was called to the stage and found out who his admirer was. The focus of this episode was the third group: Scott Amateur, his 34-year-old admirer, and Jonathan Schmidt, Scott's crush, who was 24 years old and heterosexual. But the questions go from 0 to 100 in a blink of an eye. It passed from how they have met to questioning if Scott ever had thought about any fantasy with him. Eventually, when Jonathan was called to the stage, the presenter, allegedly in an attempt to provoke a reaction, replayed Scott's answers. That, no matter how embarrassing they were, both seemed to take it pretty well, even though Jonathan said he wasn't interested, but they could still be friends. But things would take a dark turn. On March 9th of 1995, Scott left a suggestive note on Jonathan's doorstep. "John, if you want it off, you'll have to ask me. It takes a special tool. Guess who?" Jonathan, still feeling humiliated, and with Scott not leaving him alone, he completely snapped. When Jonathan saw the note, he went back to his car to buy a shotgun and used it to take Scott's life. And a few minutes later, he called 911 and confessed to the murder. Jonathan was then sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison, and the episode ended up not being aired on television. Pizza Heist. Pizza Heist was an incident that happened in the small town of Erie on August 28th of 2003. But first, a bit of the background. On August 28th of 2003, Brian Wells, who worked at the Mamma Mia's pizzeria, received an order of 2 sausage pizzas over the phone to be delivered to 8631 Peach Street, which once he got there, was the site of an abandoned radio station. There, Brian is taken hostage by 3 men, who placed a bomb on his neck, gave him a cane shotgun, and papers with instructions on what to do. At 2:30 PM, Brian was seen alone, still with the device strapped to his neck, trying to steal $250,000 from a bank, but ends up walking away with only $8,000. Brian was forced to follow what the paper said, or you can guess what would happen. When the police arrived at the scene, they caught Brian outside of a McDonald's on his way to the next instruction, where they detained him and began to evacuate the streets and the houses around the incident. The device would eventually start to beep after a sentry who was driving around saw what was happening. Due to traffic jams caused by the evacuation, the bomb squad couldn't get there in time, and thus the bomb explodes at 3:18 PM. Allegedly, the device had several trip wires to prevent the police, or Brian, from simply removing it, which could only be disarmed if Brian went to specific places to find combinations and keys. After Brian's death, it took police a lot of interviews and attempts, but in the end, the confirmed perpetrators were Marjorie Armstrong, the mastermind who was sentenced to life in prison, and Kenneth Barnes, who helped to plan and execute the heist, who was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison. With the following 2 being co-conspirators. Bill Rothstein, the person who apparently built the bomb, he never faced time in jail because he died from cancer, and Floyd Stockton, who also helped to execute the heist. He was granted immunity if he testified against Marjorie, but it never happened due to him suffering from health problems, and he passed away in 2022. A video that does a good breakdown of this case is the Wendy Goon video. Check it out after this one if you're interested. Manilla Crisis. The incident that infuriated the Philippine citizens. On August 23rd of 2010, Rolando Mendoza, a respected former police officer, ends up losing everything including his job and retirement due to a allegation. On that day, Rolando, armed with an M4, enters the bus and holds all passengers hostage with the sole intention of getting his job and benefits back. That if his motives were met, he would voluntarily handcuff himself and surrender. From the beginning to the end, various news stations were fighting for who had the best coverage of the situation, giving several angles to the viewers at home, but also to the bus's television. From that moment on, what happened was an 11-hour-long stand between Rolando Mendoza and the police. After a lot of back and forth in the negotiations, Mendoza's patience reached its peak. When he saw his brother getting arrested hours after, he brought a firearm to a hostage situation. And for you to know how outrageous this was, when the police started putting snipers in different positions, the media would simply reveal where they were. If things couldn't get any worse, Rolando Mendoza would start at the hostages, and the driver miraculously escaped and informed the police that everyone was dead. For the assault, for some reason, the ground commander chose the SWAT, even though SAF was way more prepared. After a few attempts made by the SWAT, another ground commander would finally let SAF take care of the situation, in which finally they were successful. In this tragedy, 9 died and 9 were injured. After this tragedy, the Manila police and media received a huge backlash from other countries and even citizens, bringing up the question, could this incident have been any different if the media didn't interfere? Alison and Adam. Alison Parker and Adam Ward were both employees of WDBJ-7, with Adam being the cameraman and Alison being the journalist. On August 26th of 2015, they were both at 6:46 AM in Bridgewater Plaza interviewing Vicky Garner. In the middle of the live broadcast, a man, later proved to be an ex-employee of the same news broadcast, ends up firing 15 rounds at the previous group. On that live tragedy, Adam and Alison would lose their lives on the scene, while Vicky would be severely injured. The camera briefly caught the perpetrator in the act, but would quickly switch back to the news station, while the anchor was visibly in shock. Meanwhile, other anchors behind the scene quickly reviewed the video and identified the perpetrator, being Lee Flanagan. After the incident, a manhunt was launched by the police that lasted for 4 hours, and would eventually end in a car chase, with Lee taking his own life. An investigation into Lee's social media discovered a now deleted post containing a video from Lee's phone perspective, along with several posts and a 29-page manifesto being sent to the news station by Lee himself during his run. With the reason being that he had suffered from racial and sexual harassment while working for the station, with the Charles Church incident being his tipping point. However, Lee's manager in interviews would describe him as a very argumentative person who was not dedicated and someone who blames others for his own shortcomings. And for that, he was fired in 2013. Rest in peace to all the victims in this video. And since you watched the video to the very end, what about a missing 411 case to be different this time? From now on, I'll be thanking my Patreon supporters at the end. A huge thank you goes to our Patreon supporter, Pawn, and also to you, viewer, for watching to the very end. If there's anything that I can do to improve, please tell me, and take care, my friend.